what makes someone remarkable? Do you mind being described as the white people whisperer? What is the optimal age to get married?
That year was the first year that we ever heard a teacher talk about race.
Is the college application process fair?
You start to find the non-obvious way kind of works.
Is there like a cartoonist community? So many times when we go live with these things, it's like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom.
Boom.
Welcome to the Non-Obvious Book Review. Today, I have Danielle Friedman with me, who is a published journalist, a longtime writer, an expert now in fitness, and a fantastic person to talk to about this new revolution that's an old revolution that's been going for a long time. So, Danielle, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. And, you know, the first question I've got to ask you is, what makes Let's Get Physical non-obvious?
So I've always been interested in the history of the everyday. You know, everything has a history, but it's not always obvious. And so around the time that I decided to write the book, I was really intrigued by the fact that the fitness industry and women's fitness had become this, you know, multi-billion in fitness industrial complex, and fitness studios were so ubiquitous, and exercise was, you know, just sort of taken as a given in women's lives. And I thought there has to be more to this, because I know as a feminist journalist and a health journalist that women were not always encouraged to cultivate physical strength. You know, women were considered the weaker sex. So it was sort of starting with that premise that I began to peel back the layers of the onion and sort of uncover the history of how we went from a country where women were really actively discouraged from sweating and working out to the world we live in today.
Well, and you describe the book as the story of a paradigm shift in how women view their own bodies. And the structure of it I found really interesting, both as a writer myself and also just as someone who was reading about a topic that I didn't know that much about. So you've chronicled the story of women's fitness throughout decades, but you chose a very intentional way of describing them, especially through the chapters. So can you talk a little bit about just the structure of it? And I'm just curious, like, how you came to figure out how you were going to approach telling this whole story.
Yeah. And I should say I'm a former book editor myself, a former nonfiction book editor.
I saw that.
So it was figuring out the puzzle pieces of, you know, how all the pieces fit together in the structure was something I always really enjoyed as a book editor. And it was such a treat to get to do that for my book. The book begins in the 1950s, which is really when the contemporary fitness industry was born. There was fitness before then, but it was, it didn't kind of come together and evolve into what we have today in quite the same way. And I also was grappling with the fact that, you know, fitness is so vast. And there have also been a lot of flash in the pan kind of exercise fads through the years. So the challenge was really honing this, you know, this vast field industry down into the chapters of the book. And so I decided to focus really on the movements, no pun intended, that laid the groundwork for how we move today. And it just so happened that, you know, the history of fitness, everything is interconnected. So movements that came later built on what came before. So the book begins in the 50s. It more or less sort of travels chronologically up to the present. And in each chapter, I decided to focus on one or two pioneers who's really responsible for launching that movement of movement, and then to show how you know, these early pioneers, most of whom I think have kind of been forgotten by history, influenced who came later. And the last thing I'll say is that the chapter titles, so each chapter title is like it's a verb basically.
Yeah, like run, sweat, bounce. Yep.
Exactly. And that was really intentional because throughout the whole book, I was really looking for ways to make it clear that this wasn't just like some remote history that happened to other women. It had a direct impact on the lives of women today. So by going with these active verbs that I hoped that most readers could relate to and connect with, I wanted to kind of, just form that connection with the reader, and also infuse the book with a sense of energy and motion, which
Yeah.
felt very appropriate given the topic.
Well, it definitely felt like that. I mean, the stories were very engaging. I agree. A lot of the people featured in the book, like Bonnie Prudden was the one you started with from the 1950s. Like I had never heard of her. And you kind of you sort of allude to that, I think, close to the middle of the book, where you say, you might expect a book about women's fitness to start with Jane Fonda, but that literally comes in the middle of the book. And there's so much stuff ahead of that, which is really interesting to me. But I know your journey towards this. I mean, first of all, it started with you getting fit yourself, but it also really took off when you wrote an article that went viral. So talk about that article. And as a journalist, what inspired you then to go from an article that was really popular to say to yourself, as a former book editor too, there's a whole book in this that I want to write?
Yeah. So the book really began with a story that I researched and wrote for The Cut. I am a longtime runner. Running has always been it's almost like a spiritual practice for me. It's a really big part of my overall well-being and my identity. But about 6 years ago now, I decided to take a bar workout class. For people who don't know, bar is sort of this, it's a resistance-based strength training workout performed at a ballet bar. And it had, even at that point, bar had grown to become like this multi-billion-dollar industry. And so I was curious. It also happened to be a few months before my wedding, and in a very cliche move, I decided to kind of try
Got to
to
get in shape for the wedding. I mean, that's important.
Yeah, sweating for the wedding, which I'm always deeply embarrassed to admit.
Hey, understandable.
I started taking the classes, and I really loved how they made me feel. At the time, I was also doing a lot of reporting. I'm a health journalist, as I said, on women's sexual health. And I actually noticed that many of the moves in class felt sort of like sexual. There were the pelvic tucks, and there's,
Yep.
you're on your back and you're thrusting. And so it started with, I was thinking, well, maybe there's, I want to look into like whether bar workouts actually have sexual health benefits for women. And in researching that, I stumbled on this much bigger story that was, I found even more fascinating, about Lottie Burke, who's the woman who invented bar. She invented bar in the the late 1950s in London. She was a German Jewish refugee who had fled the Nazis in the 1930s. And sure enough, she was this like free love revolutionary in an open marriage, very frank about women's sexuality, very ahead of her time. This was pre-sexual revolution. And so she created this workout, which really was fueled by the swinging 60s. And the workout does benefit women's sexual health. But in any case, I was like, oh my God, because the other thing about bar workouts is they can feel kind of prim and a little prissy, and the studios can feel a little sterile. And the contrast between Lottie Burke and the world she lived in and the studios today was just so fascinating to me. So I wrote about Lottie Burke and the history of bar and how it traveled from the 1960s London scene to, literally my neighborhood on the Upper East Side of New York City. And while I was reporting that story for The Cut, at one point I thought, it would be great to talk to the person who wrote like the book on the history of women's fitness, just to contextualize this. And I was really surprised and then excited to discover that book did not exist. There have been a few books about like the history of the
That
gym.
is exciting. I mean, as a writer, you're like, oh, yeah, this is what I want to write and nobody did it before. Like it's because it's deflating to do the other thing, right? Oh, I have this great idea. And then,
Absolutely.
oh no, somebody wrote a book about that.
Exactly. And like you said, as a former book editor, the light bulb went off. I had always sort of been on the lookout for a topic that I felt was rich enough and complex enough, and that I felt strongly enough about to cover at Book Lane. Then it was pretty immediate. I was like, this is it. And yeah, I'm really fortunate. I had the opportunity to tell this story.
Yeah, and there are so many interesting characters throughout the book. And one of the things that you do write about, and I think is becomes pretty apparent, especially in the early part of the book, is just how many of these movements were led by white women
Mm-hmm.
and dominated by affluent people.
Mm-hmm.
And so up to a certain point, if you only kind of read the first part of the book, you'd be like, well, this is a very narrow audience, not narrow in terms of a small audience, but narrow in terms of, one dimensional. But then you talk about how it starts to open up. There's more people in fitness who have body positive messages, who
Yeah.
are, you talk about Black marathon runners. I
Mm-hmm.
can't remember the name of the runner you mentioned, but
Yeah.
you start to talk about how diversity and the broader audience crept into that.
Yeah.
Was that intentional for you, that you had to go and seek out those stories? Because they definitely don't seem as mainstream as like Jane Fonda.
Yeah. Well, I was, I thought it was really important in telling the story to investigate why the fitness industry's sort of most visible history is a history of white women, both the leaders and the participants. And it's fascinating. I mean, I was interested in the history of exclusion that I knew existed in the industry, and which traces back, well, in the context of my book, to even the 1950s and the communities whom the early kind of marketing campaigns around the nation's physical fitness were directed to, and those were white, middle, and upper class communities. So as the story progressed, I was really interested in learning about first of all, what it was like to be a woman of color, interested in fitness, trying to break in as an instructor or an entrepreneur, and as a participant. And thankfully, many of the women who were kind of these boundary breakers are still around today. And I was able to hear their stories. I wanted to give a personal face to it. And I also really wanted to try to illuminate, and I just really scratched the surface, with this in my book, but I wanted to illuminate why some of the health disparities that exist, the racial health disparities that exist in this country, do exist. And so, we have a long history of fitness, and fit bodies have long been equated with kind of virtuous bodies. And there's this morality thing about fitness and weight. And I wanted to bust the myth that, to have a fit body, all you have to do is like have the willpower to exercise, and to kind of reveal how so many hidden forces, from having the time to move, having a safe space, having the facilities, even being allowed into a gym. And many gyms have, there were several high profile cases in the 90s, in which gyms were just actively discriminating against Black people who wanted to become members. I wanted to show that like it's so much more complicated than just get off the couch, So there's a lot more I could say, but that's that was really what was fueling the way, the stories that I chose to share in the book, and as well as its larger mission.
A lot of the stories that you do tell seem to be about these sustained movements, these fitness
Mhm.
pioneers who worked for decades to kind of get their message out there, and
Mhm.
it took that long. If you ask people today about fitness, a lot of what they might describe are fads that basically blip and then go away
Mhm.
instantly. Is that a recent thing, that there's just fitness fads that we latch onto and then leave, or has that always been around and you
Oh
just
my gosh.
tried not to focus too much on that?
More of the latter. I mean, and if anything, so exercise science didn't really become a field until the 1970s, really.
Mhm.
And so that meant that there was room for so much quackery, so many fads that
It's a good way to describe it, yeah.
people wanted to believe in. In the book, I talk a little bit about the history of like these machines that would vibrate and promise to kind of like, shake, rattle, and roll your fat
Yeah.
away, which
Yep.
were a major industry. There were these salons, these particular, the biggest
Yeah.
ones, Slenderella, where women would like sign up like they were going to a bar studio.
Yeah, and
Um,
now they're punchlines, right? A lot of those devices
exactly,
at least, yeah.
exactly. And yeah, so the fads are fun to think about and to look back on. And I have no doubt that they're going to continue to proliferate, partly because
Mm.
exercise is work. It is hard for all of the reasons, including some of the ones I just mentioned, but like having the time, there's so many factors and forces working against us. Um, we would love to believe that like, a shake weight is all that it takes. Um,
Or a pill,
yeah,
which
yeah,
isn't even exercise.
exactly. Um, but yeah, so I really wanted to focus on, like I said, the big movements that laid the groundwork for how we move today, what's considered acceptable, what's popular, and also kind of some of the major pillars of the fitness industry. um, I
Mm,
also, one more thing I'll say about that is that and this was sort of this goes back to the non-obvious element, but I had noticed that when women's fitness history was covered in popular media, it was often treated as a joke, as like the
yeah.
shiny leotards and the fluorescents and the leg warmers. And there is a lot to laugh at, but I saw a much more important story here about the rise of women's physical autonomy and trust and confidence in their bodies that went so much deeper than the fads. And so I
Mm.
really wanted to focus on that story.
Yeah, and you do, interestingly, you tell these stories of the moments when it is maybe a joke, but hypersexualized too, like the first
Mhm.
women's marathon where they had the Playboy bunnies coming in and showing up at the marathon to, drive attention, which obviously it
Absolutely.
did.
Yeah, yeah.
And this nuance between these ideas of, on the one hand, fitness as a way of empowerment and as a way of feeling
Mhm.
better about yourself, and on the other hand, fitness as this outlet for insecurity. And a
Yeah,
lot of the driving forces, especially the story of Jane Fonda, I mean, I didn't realize the dimension to which she'd really struggled, and the fitness was sort of her chance to do that, but also driven a lot by insecurity.
exactly, exactly.
And so finding the balance between these two things must have been an interesting challenge as you're writing about this movement.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I often describe it as kind of like the central tension of the book, fitness for women as a tool for liberation versus a tool for oppression. And it was this,
Yeah.
sort of ongoing fight between fitness offering women a path to control their bodies while also reinforcing, sort of this larger patriarchal uh, desire to control women's bodies. And so, um, and I mean that in the sense of by reinforcing, really unrealistic for most women beauty standards, and as fitness became more accepted for women, because it really wasn't when my book begins, it also became more expected of women. And along with that, the standards for what a beautiful, fit body looked like inched continually out of reach. I talk about in the book how for even like for Jane Fonda, even Jane Fonda's body wasn't even realistic for Jane Fonda. She has talked very openly about how she struggled with eating disorders and just was at war with her body and her desire to be thin for many, many decades, including while she was um, ascending to global icon status for her workout. So my
Mm.
hope was that by digging into that tension and revealing it and showing sort of the good and the bad, I would maybe create some awareness so that women today, and this is starting to happen in the industry, which is wonderful, can be more conscious of it, be more aware, and harness sort of the positive aspects of women's fitness, and maybe kiss the more toxic aspects and force them by.
That's a good aspiration, I think. One of the things that you wrote in the book was that in the 1980s, the fit body became, you called it, a symbol of discipline, determination, and drive. Do you think that's still what it is today?
To a very large extent. I mean, Jane Fonda's motto was "Discipline is liberation," which also speaks to what we were just talking about, like, so
Mhm.
perfectly. There's a double meaning there. Um, yes, I think that I think a certain kind of fit body still is held as, a um, held up as sort of the worthiest kind of body. We still face rampant, fat stigma and fat shaming in our culture. I think there is more of an awareness, particularly as the science catches up, that you can be a fit body doesn't just look one way. You can be
Mhm.
a larger bodied person and be extremely fit and healthy. Um, and in the converse too, you can look fit and actually be miserable and dealing with a lot of serious health issues.
Yeah, yeah,
You
that's
know,
true.
so we have a more I do think, there is a more nuanced um understanding of it. The industry itself, has evolved pretty rapidly. I mean, I think we see this more in like big coastal cities or just big cities, but most fitness instructors with the major brands do not talk about weight loss or love handles or problem areas the way they did just 10, 15 years ago. um,
Why is that, do you think?
I think as the culture evolved, um, I was just looking at a book published in 2010 that was like striking for how focused on weight loss it was in the context of empowerment.
Mhm.
So as the culture has evolved, I think, and particularly social media has become what it is. I think that, I mean, it's complicated and there's a number of reasons, but there's been a lot of pushback to brands that shame women in particular for having like any, less than like quote unquote perfect bodies, or for being
Yeah.
larger bodied. And when brands try to sort of glorify that image, there is a very large vocal audience that now has the power to push back and say, hell no, that's not what we're after. I also think, I mean, this is, I think, a really positive change, but the power of fitness and movement for mental health has really started to kind of it's just seen a rise. There's another paradigm shift, I think, that's happening right now, where people are recognizing that fitness can be for a lot more than aesthetics. And it always has been. I mean, that, again, that's part of the central argument of my book. But when it comes to the marketing and the messaging, um, thankfully we're at the very beginning of starting to see a shift where, moving away from selling physical transformation and instead just selling an opportunity to feel good, which has its own which has its own sort
Yeah.
of complications, but maybe,
Yeah.
maybe a step in the right direction.
A lot of the rise in the fitness movement, the women's fitness movement that you write about was sort of based in the age of mass media, right? And you're
Mhm.
like this one video cassette, which it often was, sold 10 million copies, 12 million copies. I mean, now we're in an era of fractured media. There's tons
Mhm.
of fitness influencers online who all have their micro followings. I mean, I think that
Mhm.
the Peloton brand is a good example. I mean, that brand exploded because of individual influencers
Yes.
who built their own followings. And so now there's 100 Jane Fondas and their workout's not named after them. It's someone
Mhm.
else in
Yeah.
some cases. Where do
Yeah.
you see this going? I mean, project forward into the future. Like if you wrote this book 10 years from now and you added 4 chapters, They probably wouldn't be about one person, or centered at least on one person, each one of those for the 2020s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is a good point. I think that the difference is many of the pioneers that I wrote about in the past. I mean, Jane Fonda is in some ways the exception because her brand, she was already a major global celebrity, movie star, activist when she launched her workout. She was like 43 when she got into the fitness business, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, there wasn't as much of with the ones who came before, like Judy Shepherd Missett, who created Jazzercise, or the women who burst into the marathon, and opened doors for women to run. They were responsible, but they launched these movements that became really populist. But to answer your question about going forward, I mean, I'm kind of have to come back to what I was just talking about. I think we are seeing this major shift in recognizing the potential of exercise and movement for mental health and overall well-being. And I recently reported for the New York Times about how there's kind of a new movement to use weightlifting as a tool, a complementary therapy for healing trauma, and people with PTSD are benefiting. I've spoken with a number of therapists who are actually getting certified in different movement forms. And so
Yeah.
I think, the book ends, the first chapter of my book is called Reduce, and the last chapter is Expand. And that was very intentional. And, Reduce referred both to, it was a euphemism for losing weight in the 50s, and also just all of the social forces that encouraged women to be small. And Expand is kind of where we are right now. And also, expanding our idea of what a fit body looks like and what movement can offer women and everybody. So I would like to think that if there were 4 more chapters, if I were to write a sequel in 10 years, I would still be interested in the stories of the pioneers who were ahead of their time and pushed the doors open and helped to accelerate that paradigm shift. But I would also think that it would be much less about how fitness was used, or I would hope fitness was used as a tool to hold women back, and instead as a way to allow women to, to feel good and kind of, it sounds so cheesy, but like reach their potential, both in terms of just mental health and happiness and life satisfaction, and our role in society.
And on a message of hope. That's perfect. The book is Let's Get Physical. It is fantastic. It's a wonderful chronicle of the women's fitness movement and highly readable. I very much enjoyed it. Danielle, thanks for joining me on the Non-Obvious Book Review. It was an awesome pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. It really has been a pleasure.